Too late. They said it's already too late. 4 armored vehicles, 2 electronic jamming trucks, and an entire column of light anti-air artillery were thundering down through Devil's Backbone. If they reached Hoover Dam, the whole town of Boulder would be drowned beneath a raging sea, and half the state of Colorado would be plunged into darkness. The F-16 Second were locked out. The SEAL operatives confirmed no one could possibly stop them within the next 8 minutes. But at the far end of the runway, beneath the shadow of a weather-worn hangar, a woman who seemed to be nothing more than a maintenance technician climbed into the cockpit of an abandoned A-10. And her name was Spectre 7. At an airbase deep in the heart of Colorado, as the sun slipped away behind the Rocky Mountains and darkness stretched across the runway, there was a woman almost no one paid much attention to. Claire Donovan did not walk with the commanding presence of an officer, nor did she carry the aura of a decorated fighter pilot. She moved quietly, blending into the clatter of chains, the rattle of metal, and the acrid sting of burnt oil. If anyone noticed her at all, they only saw a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair, eyes that so often cast downward, and a coverall stained with grease, as though she had been born to dissolve into the gray backdrop of the hangar walls. On the roster, Claire was nothing more than a contracted technician. No rank, no insignia, no authority. To many of the younger men and women on base, she was just the hangar old lady, a nickname tossed around more than once, half in jest, half in condescension. While the young pilots leaned against the polished wings of their brand-new F-35 Second, laughing about speed, stealth technology, and acrobatic loops that dazzled crowds at air shows, Claire lingered in the shadows, patiently wiping the dust off the wings of a faded A-10 Thunderbolt II. That plane was not glamorous. It was squat, chubby, ungainly, a design many dismissed as obsolete. While the F-16 Second and F-35 Second embodied power and modernity, the A-10 looked like a gruff, awkward brute, built for only one purpose: to fly low, take punishment, and tear apart whatever heavy armor lay beneath it. To the fresh generation of pilots, it was nothing more than a relic that belonged in a museum. But to Claire, it was the last friend still willing to listen. She knew every scar in its skin, every crude weld along its frame, every peculiar groan in its engines. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, Claire placed her calloused hand on the chipped paint and whispered, as though speaking to an old companion. People might laugh at such a thing, but she knew. In this noisy, indifferent world, the A-10 was the only thread left tying her to herself. The young pilots hardly noticed her. They had too much to prove, too many flight hours to log, too many lights and cameras waiting. If their eyes did pass over her, it was only with a shrug, as if she were just another fixture of the base, like an old light bulb in the corner, ignored until it burned out. Sometimes stray jokes were tossed her way. About the oil-stained gloves she always wore. About how she spent entire evenings fussing over a flying hog. No one wanted to sit inside. Claire only answered with a thin smile, not a word, as though long accustomed to being counted among the invisible. The base had already decided. She no longer had rank, no longer had titles, no longer belonged on the flight roster. They filed her neatly under contract maintenance staff, tidy, harmless, and unimportant. Yet Claire's silence carried a kind of weight no one ever noticed. Like the tiny switches in a cockpit, small, overlooked, but capable of changing everything when the moment came. There was something ironic, perhaps even cruelly, so that while the whole base marveled at the supersonic speed of the F-35, it was the outdated A-10 that drew the most curious stares from visitors during open days. Strangers' eyes would widen at the sight of the massive GAU-8 cannon, turning slowly, and someone would inevitably ask in astonishment, "Does this thing actually fire?" Claire would usually just smile, offering no explanation. But in her eyes, there was always a fleeting spark, a glimmer of memory from a past she held tightly to herself. Each evening, as the mountain shadows stretched long across the runway, the airbase seemed to divide into two separate worlds. Out on the main ramp, laughter and whistles echoed as young pilots bragged about their maneuvers. In the dim corner of the hangar, Claire bent low beneath the A-10's wings, her hands blackened with grease, her coverall marked by sun and wind. To others it was a ruin, to her it was a promise. Once, a young pilot passing by tossed out a mocking remark. "Why don't you just quit already, go home and plant roses?" Claire gave no reply. But in her mind a thought flared. Roses were beautiful, yes, but which rose could ever withstand the storming wind of this engine? The idea made her chuckle. Just a small smile, but enough to carry her through another day. That was Claire's life. Faint, quiet, like the background of a painting no one thought mattered. Yet no one seemed to realize it was the background that kept the whole canvas from falling apart. And in a world where every spotlight shone on the new, the bright, the glamorous, who could have imagined that this invisible woman and her outdated machine were about to become the story America would remember? Because, in only 8 minutes, history would call their names. Not everyone on the base had forgotten Claire. To a handful of the older mechanics sometimes, while sipping coffee inside the hangar, a name would slip from their lips. Spectre 7. The sound of it lingered like a ghostly whisper, enough to silence anyone who had ever heard it before. Because Spectre 7 was no random number. It was a call sign that once struck fear across the skies of Afghanistan, the name infantrymen prayed for and enemies cursed in the dark. Claire had once been a pilot of the 74th Fighter Squadron, a unit regarded as legend even within its own ranks. On missions no map ever drew, through valleys no reporter ever mentioned, she had flown lower than anyone dared, keeping the battered wings of her A-10 steady, and returning alive when many of her comrades did not. The A-10 was often called the Warthog, loud, heavy, and ugly. But under Claire's hands it became a silent hunter, relentless, stubborn, and never the kind to abandon anyone on the ground. The A-10-inch Hangar Bay 14, the one no one even bothered to look at anymore, still bore a scar of steel. A crude patch of metal along its left flank, where anti-aircraft fire had once ripped it open in the Kunar Valley. That day, Claire had risked everything to hold her line, shielding a retreating squad of infantry from a deadly ambush. Rounds screamed through the air as if to shred the very sky itself. When smoke poured from her engine, everyone believed she wouldn't make it out. But then, like a ghost, Claire pulled the A-10 through the narrow canyon at the very last instant. When she landed back at base, the fuselage was torn and battered, her flight suit stained with blood from a wound across her shoulder. Claire stepped down with eyes red from dust and exhaustion, without saying a word. Instead of heading to the field hospital as ordered, she dragged herself straight to the colonel's office. Standing before him, she unclipped her pilot badge, dropped it on his desk, and rasped in a hoarse voice, "You don't want me up there anymore." The colonel remained silent, staring at her for a long time. Then he closed the file in front of him, as if shutting a door. That day, Claire disappeared from the sky. No ceremony, no farewell. Only cold paperwork and a faded line in a report, transferred to civilian contract status. The military forgot her. The world never mentioned her again. On official records, Spectre 7 had never existed, but on the worn fuselage of that A-10, every fracture still remembered. And inside Claire, the memories never left. Sometimes, in the long nights at the base when everyone else had gone, she sat alone beneath the A-10's wings, closing her eyes, letting the echoes return. The desperate cries of infantrymen over the radio, the GAU-8's thunder rolling like a storm, the metal shrieking as rounds tore through it. At times, the memories came back so vividly she couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the thought that a person could be erased from history with nothing more than the snap of a file folder. How convenient. On today's base, no one spoke of Spectre 7. Young pilots grew up with drones, with modern radar, with the philosophy of unmanned war. They had no reason to believe that a silver-haired, stoop-backed woman had once been the name that made the Taliban tremble. And Claire never tried to prove it. Perhaps it was her silence that only deepened the haze around the name, leaving Spectre 7 drifting between myth and memory, alive only in the minds of a few old mechanics. Yet every so often, the truth revealed itself in small ways. Once, a curious young airman climbed into the A-10-inch Bay 14, pointing at the ugly steel patch. "Why does this look like someone blasted it apart and slapped it back together?" The old mechanic nearby only shrugged, muttering under his breath, "Ask Spectre 7. The young man scoffed. "Who's that? Some horror movie?" And Claire, standing a few steps away, only lowered her head and tightened another bolt, as if she hadn't heard a thing. Maybe that was the paradox. The one who once ruled the skies had become nothing more than a shadow in a forgotten corner of a hangar. But within that paradox lay a bitter truth. Sometimes those erased on paper are the very ones who still know how to save lives when disaster strikes. Inside Claire, she needed no recognition. But every time her hand touched that rough scar of steel, the memories came back. She remembered the faces pulled out of Kunar Valley. She remembered the fleeting looks of gratitude before the iron ghost vanished into the smoke. That was why she stayed. Not to be acknowledged, but to keep the A-10 and the old promise alive. And now, the name Spectre 7 was whispered again. Not on some distant battlefield, but right here, in a base that seemed safe. An urgent call, an impossible mission, was drawing near. The only question. When the alarm ripped across the sky of the base, everyone assumed it was just another drill. The piercing wail was familiar, yet this time it carried a different weight. Urgent, cold, heavy, like a steel plate pressing down against the chest of anyone who heard it. The young fighter pilots sprinted toward the gleaming line of F-16's second, engines primed to roar. Ground crews scrambled for cover, ducking beneath the shadows of hangars. Everywhere, chaos spread like a hornet's nest struck by a stick. From the loudspeakers boomed a hurried voice. "Threat from Devil's Backbone. Armored convoy with electronic jamming. All air support assets deploy immediately." The very mention of that name, Devil's Backbone, made men swallow hard. It was no ordinary mountain ridge, but a maze of jagged canyons where radar faltered and comms signals nearly died. F-16 second couldn't fly low enough. Drones were easily jammed. Only one weapon had ever been designed to survive in the shadows of those cliffs. The old A-10 nobody wanted to touch. In the uproar, a young officer shouted, "Is anyone on the A-10? Silence. Not a single hand rose. Everyone knew better than to volunteer for that lumbering beast. Then suddenly, a hoarse yet steady voice rang out, like something echoing from deep underground. "I am." The air froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward the far end of the hangar. There, a woman stood tall in a faded maintenance suit, shoulders stained with grease, silver strands of hair catching the glow of the setting Sunday. On her chest, an old ID tag glinted. Claire Donovan, former A-10 pilot, call sign, Spectre 7. The silence grew so heavy you could hear the clatter of a wrench hitting the concrete. One of the older mechanics dropped his entire toolbox, eyes wide with disbelief. "No, it can't be. Not her." His voice trembled. From the control tower, the commander's voice thundered down, urgent yet unyielding. "Spectre, you've been off the roster for years. Our jets can't get inside that canyon. Our drones won't last. But your A-10 can." In that moment, fragments of the past surged back. Claire had sworn never to climb into a cockpit again. The files were closed, her title erased. And now, the very base that had forgotten her was turning, desperate, to the ghost they had cast aside. She didn't answer right away. Claire's gaze swept across the crowd. Young faces, tense and anxious. None of them had ever felt the grip of anti-aircraft fire closing in. They belonged to the age of touchscreens and satellites, not dust, smoke, and the scream of metal tearing around their ears. And yet now, they needed her, the ghost they once dismissed. She drew a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of oil and steel, the metallic tang of the A-10 resting silent in Bay 14. Every bolt, every chipped patch of paint seemed to call her name. Claire walked toward it, slow but resolute. Behind her, whispers rippled astonishment, doubt, even unease. A few young pilots gave half smirks, laughter tinged with nervousness, unsure whether to feel relief or dread that a retired relic was suddenly their only hope. There was irony here. The military had erased Claire with a single signature, and now, after just one alarm, they were begging for her return. History, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. She stopped before the nose of the A-10. Her hand rested gently on the cold steel, at the very spot patched long ago in the Kunar Valley. That scar of metal had once saved a platoon of infantrymen. Now, perhaps, it would open a new chapter for them all. The commander's voice still waited from the tower. The entire base seemed to hold its breath. Claire lifted her head, eyes unwavering. No words were needed. In war, some answers are spoken only through action. She climbed into the cockpit, every movement smooth as if she had never left. Harness tightened, switches flipped, warning lights flickered awake, like stars reappearing after a storm. The A-10 shuddered, then roared to life with its familiar growl, heavy, rugged, but faithful. The hangar trembled, and Claire allowed herself a faint smile. The old friend had not abandoned her. The young pilots stood watching, many of them seeing an A-10 come alive for the first time. Its engine sounded nothing like the sharp arrogance of an F-16. Instead, it was low, stubborn, like the quiet chuckle of an old brawler rolling up his sleeves. One of them whispered, almost in awe, "God, it actually still runs." Claire pulled down the canopy, sunlight shattering across the glass. In that instant, the entire base realized Spectre 7 was not a legend. Spectre 7 had returned. In the crimson-orange light of sunset, the sky above the base trembled with the deep growl of engines. Metal clanged. Belts of GAU-8 ammunition were fed into the belly of the A-10, each round sliding in like the death drums of an invisible army on the march. The shells, each as long as a man's hand, cold and merciless, aligned into a massive revolving circle. Beneath its wings, two AGM-65 Mavericks sat in silence, like the watchful eyes of a predator waiting to be unleashed. Claire walked slowly toward the aircraft, each step firm, deliberate, as though retracing a road that fate had once forced her to abandon. Her hand brushed the dust off the faded shark-mouth paint on the nose, and for a fleeting second she could almost hear its roar from years past. A faint smile crossed her lips, sharp and quiet. "All right, old friend, one more time." When the engines ignited, the thunder that erupted was not mere noise, it was a declaration of war. The entire base fell silent. Young pilots held their breath. Mechanics stared at one another, stunned to witness something they thought had long since vanished into museums. The atmosphere felt like a scene from a film where the hero returns, but with an ending no one could predict. Through her headset, the controller's voice came, urgent yet solemn. "Spectre 7, cleared for immediate takeoff. Devil's Backbone awaits." Claire answered with only 2 words, "Copy that." Nothing more was needed. War had no room for speeches. The A-10 rolled forward, its wheels grinding against the tarmac like the teeth of an old beast preparing for one last leap. Then it surged ahead, the heavy frame shrieking as it lifted from the ground. In a blink, the steel bird was airborne, skimming along the burning red cliffs of Colorado, plunging straight into Devil's Backbone. Inside the cockpit, Claire gripped the stick tighter. Wind screamed across the canopy. The engines rattled behind her, and all of it blended with the pounding rhythm of her heartbeat. Devil's Backbone loomed ahead, not a canyon but a labyrinth of sheer rock walls, draped in shadow and death. The comms began to break apart into static. Warning lights flashed, yet Claire held her speed low, weaving through the stone corridors like an old dancer still mastering the floor. The A-10 was not beautiful, nor fast, but it was stubborn, resilient, just like the pilot guiding it. From afar, the armored convoy emerged, iron beasts moving across the dirt, covered in red dust as though rising from the earth itself. Their jamming systems flooded her radar screen with blinding waves of white. Any young pilot would have been lost. But Claire needed no radar. She read the terrain as one reads an old familiar book, every ridge, every curve etched into her memory. She adjusted her sights. The GAU-8 was primed, and then, in that decisive instant, her finger squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared not a series of shots, but a metallic symphony, 70 rounds in a single second, pouring down like a storm of fire. The ground shook. Enemy armor shattered, exploding into fragments that ricocheted against the canyon walls. Devil's Backbone blazed with fire and smoke. At the base, eyes were glued to the interference-filled screens, catching only flashes of light erupting from the gorge. An old mechanic exhaled. God Almighty, that thing still knows how to bite. The younger pilots could only mutter in awe, their voices laced with both fear and reverence. Claire dove lower, skimming the ground by mere dozens of feet. She released a Maverick. The missile tore from its wing, streaking like lightning, and struck the convoy's command vehicle. A blinding white flash engulfed the column, ripping it apart like a steel chain snapping in two. Inside the cockpit, Claire drew in a deep breath. Her heart pounded, but her eyes stayed clear, focused. Her hands were steady, as though the forgotten years had never passed. Spectre 7 had never disappeared, it had only been waiting for rebirth. Smoke and fire consumed the canyon. Radio signals began to stabilize again. The voice from command returned, this time heavy with relief and exhilaration. Target destroyed. Spectre 7, mission accomplished. In that moment, Claire gave no reply. She only gazed toward the horizon painted in red. A faint smile stirred inside her. Yes, the A-10 and she both had been erased, struck from the rolls, but it seemed there was still one reason left to come back. The heavy aircraft pulled away from the canyon, climbing into the vast sky. The sunset washed across its steel skin, turning it into a fiery arrow racing toward the future. At the base, the crowd erupted in cheers, yet none of them knew that within Claire's heart, one quiet question lingered. The sky behind Claire burned bright, like an oil painting torn apart by fire and smoke. The jagged rocks of Devil's Backbone cast violent shadows across the cockpit glass, while in her headset the warning sirens wailed without pause, like the rebuke of fate itself. The left engine glowed red. Hydraulic fluid streaked into dark stains, signaling that the old A-10 had little time left. And yet, the iron beast kept roaring, fighting to hold the rhythm of its heavy wings within the canyon. Below, the entire armored convoy was nothing more than blackened carcasses, flames rising in clusters. Red-hot scraps of metal lay scattered like the bones of a slaughtered army. And at the heart of that inferno, Hoover Dam still stood, unbroken, untouched. The small houses at its base remained safe, serene. The very thought of it lit Claire's eyes with a calm she had not felt in years. She could have pulled the ejection lever. She could have let the A-10 crash, saving herself under the white bloom of a parachute, just as in countless drills from the past. But no, her hands clamped the stick tighter. A pilot never abandons a comrade. Even if that comrade is nothing more than an aging block of steel the world has already cast aside. Claire pulled back, coaxing the A-10 a little higher. Each jolt hammered into the frame like a blacksmith's strike. The needles dropped lower, fuel leaked, smoke blurred the canopy. 1 second, 2 seconds. The engine coughed, wheezing like an asthmatic old man desperate for one last breath. Claire laughed under her breath for a moment. This machine was as stubborn as she was. At the base, the crowd watched the radar, now clear of static. The blips marking the convoy had vanished, leaving only one flickering signal, Spectre 7. The room erupted like a wave, then fell silent as AWACS reported the A-10 was critically damaged. No one breathed loud, as if even their exhale could snap another blade in the distant sky. Claire pressed on. The path ahead twisted into a jagged spine, the return route winding like a maze. She knew she had only one chance. A single wrong turn and the plane would smash into the cliffs, scattered to pieces. But if she ejected now, no one would remember the old beast that had saved an entire town. Minute by minute, she felt the tremor in the stick, the heartbeat of a creature close to death. Suddenly, the left engine coughed smoke and died, its roar gone, leaving only the heavy drag of air. Claire bit her lip, her grip unyielding, her foot steady on the throttle, forcing the right engine to carry the burden. The A-10 shuddered, then, astonishingly, leveled out as if it too understood this was the last time it had to fight. When the runway appeared in the distance, her heart pounded harder. They always said landing was the most dangerous part of any mission, and with a battered machine like this, it was nothing short of walking a tightrope over an abyss. Smoke trailed thick behind. The landing gear dropped with a hoarse shriek, like lungs gasping for air. Claire steadied the stick, locked her speed. The A-10 slammed down. The impact jolted the frame so violently it seemed ready to tear apart, but then the wheels bit the tarmac, clinging tight. The beast dragged itself along, leaving a long trail of smoke, sparks bursting from its wounded landing gear. At last it lurched, stuttered, and fell still, lying silent like a war-torn animal collapsing after its final hunt. The base exploded in cheers. Young soldiers broke into a sprint, chasing after the smoke-shrouded A-10. An old mechanic dropped to his knees, wiping his eyes, whispering, "It's still alive. They're both still alive." The cockpit canopy popped open. Claire climbed out, stepping down the wing, her flight suit smeared with soot, her face wet with sweat. No words were needed, their eyes said everything. What shone there was not only admiration for a pilot, but reverence for someone who had chosen to live and die with a forgotten machine, proving that true worth never rusts. She lifted her gaze to the sky, still painted with the red of sunset. Inside, the feeling was both victory and emptiness. She knew this was no triumphal hymn, only a chapter closing. But at least, this chapter ended with survival, not death. And in the glimmering eyes of the young pilots watching her, Claire realized one thing. It wasn't just her own life that had been saved. The memory of courage had been passed on to the next generation. The shrieking scrape of steel grinding against asphalt still echoed in Claire's ears, like a death knell stretched into eternity. When the A-10 finally came to a halt, the entire world around her seemed to stop as well. White smoke drifted across the runway, mingling with the acrid stench of burning oil, thickening the air like the fog of a battlefield. In that frozen silence, no one saw a pilot who had disobeyed orders. They saw only the silhouette of a warrior who had just walked out of hell. Claire opened the canopy, every motion deliberate, as though each movement weighed 1,000 pounds. She stepped down, her boots touching the ground, one hand lingering on the scorched skin of the fuselage, hot as burning coal. That old war machine had lived again with her, and now it lay still, gasping for breath, but whole. No one dared to intrude on that moment. Fire crews stood frozen with hoses in their grip. Medics held their stretchers but did not advance, and the other pilots watched in reverent silence. Beyond the fence, a sea of people had gathered. Mechanics with oil-stained faces, cooks still dusted in flour on their aprons, officers in crisp uniforms, young soldiers with fire in their eyes, all of them stood motionless, as if some invisible hand had stilled them. They looked at the woman who had been forgotten, the one whose military file held only a dry line or two about procedural violations, missing from roster. And now, she stood there, her flight suit covered in soot and ash, shining brighter than any metal ever could. The base commander stepped forward. He did not shout, nor deliver a speech. His voice was low, gravelly, yet each word rang like an order carved into stone. You disobeyed orders, but you saved the dam, and you saved this town. There was no applause, yet the air itself seemed to erupt. Everyone understood. Sometimes war is not decided by rigid rules, but by those willing to break them when the moment demands. A young pilot, barely 25, stared at Claire. His eyes burned, desperate to memorize every detail. Her hair tousled by the wind, the smoke staining her gloves, the black oil streaked across her sleeve. Claire caught his gaze and managed a weary smile. In those eyes, she saw the future, a new generation now entrusted with a flame that could never die. The airfield held its solemn silence until suddenly one clap rang out, then another and another, until the entire base erupted in thunderous applause. Some whistled, some shouted. A few young soldiers pumped their fists into the sky. Claire was unaccustomed to such noise. Her world had been briefings no one listened to, reports no one read. But this was different. This was not the recognition of protocol, it was the respect of human beings. She walked slowly, passing a line of young pilots. Some looked down, faces red as if caught meeting a hero in the flesh. An old mechanic cleared his throat, then suddenly raised his hand in a salute, a stiff, awkward gesture, yet his eyes spoke volumes. Salutes followed, one after another, until the entire line stood straight as steel. Claire let out a faint laugh. Any outsider might think she had just been elected president. In that instant, one thought struck her. Perhaps the old beast would never fly again. It had given enough. But could a warrior truly rest while the battlefield still burned beyond the horizon? The question lingered, a whisper from the steel machine lying silent behind her. That night, the base held a small celebration. No champagne, only strong coffee, trays of biscuits, and laughter rasped raw by smoke. Everyone wanted to get close to Claire, to hear her story, to ask what it felt like to face missiles, to know what she thought in that final moment, but Claire spoke little. She sat quietly in a corner, sipping her coffee, letting the noise and the laughter fill the room. For her, the greatest joy was not the cheers, it was knowing she had passed something on, a faith that had once been lost. When the clock neared midnight, Claire slipped away. Out on the tarmac, the A-10 still lay beneath the yellow floodlights, its scorched skin like a scar. She approached, placing her hand against the cold frame. A long breath escaped her lips, heavy with relief and regret alike. Inside her, two forces pulled at once, one urging her to leave it all behind, the other urging her to take to the sky again, if only one more time. They often say that victory on the battlefield ends when the guns fall silent. But for Claire, the real battle only began after that, deep inside the heart, where invisible scars clung like gun smoke that refused to fade. When she returned to the locker room, Claire opened an old compartment untouched for years. A thin layer of dust lay across it like a shroud over memories someone had tried to bury. At the bottom, neatly tucked away, was a black patch, so worn its threads were frayed, embroidered with a falcon and a broken star, the emblem of Spectre 7. It was not just fabric, but a fragment of soul. Claire picked it up, resting it in her palm, feeling the rough, cold stitches. The fluorescent light caught on it, and the falcon seemed ready to take flight once more. She carefully slipped it into the pocket of her flight suit, close to her heart, not for display but as a reminder that she had never truly disappeared. The name Spectre 7, the Ghost 7, was no longer a cruel jest. It had become proof that even ghosts can return from the void. Outside, the A-10 was towed into the hangar. Its fuselage was scorched, its wings scaled with cracks like the hide of an old beast. Yet it remained intact, a warrior refusing to yield. The old mechanic tapped gently on its iron skin, as though consoling a comrade who had just survived the brink of death. No one called it scrap metal anymore. It had reclaimed its name. For the first time in many years, the base intercom spoke not with a hollow command, but with rare respect. Spectre 7. Welcome home. Claire smiled faintly. That smile was not for the crowd, nor for glory. It was for herself, for the old steel beast lying there, for the Hoover Dam still standing tall in the distance, and for the small town that still glowed with light against the dark. The sky had taken so much from her, but this time it had given something back. She stepped outside, where the evening wind from the Rockies howled fiercely. Claire tilted her face upward, letting the gusts sweep through her smoke-streaked hair. Suddenly, within the wind, she heard familiar echoes, the shriek of the GAU-8, the scream of missiles, the thunder of that weary old engine. But instead of haunting her, those sounds now became a victory chorus, a score written for her alone. The ghosts of the past no longer hunted Claire. They no longer bound her, no longer whispered in her ear each night. Now they flew with her, merging into the wind, like the wings of a falcon that would never stop spreading wide. That night, as the base settled into silence, Claire walked alone onto the empty runway. Above her stretched a sky full of stars, vast enough to make humanity feel impossibly small. She thought of the endless years, the repetitive drills, the marks against her record, the doubting eyes. And then she laughed a light, husky laugh, like the rumble of an A-10 engine sputtering back to life after a long winter. "Maybe I really am old," she murmured, but her eyes shone as if she were 25 again. Inside the base, the young pilots were still awake, whispering about the day. Some called Claire a living legend, others argued it was nothing more than a reckless gamble. But all agreed on one truth. They had just witnessed something textbooks would never teach, that courage is not found in orders, but in the moment a person decides not to give up. Claire did not seek honor. What she needed had already come. The gaze of the next generation. The burning eyes of that young pilot, barely 25. That was enough. The flame would not die. Tomorrow she might face reports, investigations, even punishment. The military never spares those who break discipline. But tonight, on this cold runway, none of that mattered. She had proven that a forgotten name could still become a beacon of belief. Far off, the airfield lights flickered, the winds of the Rockies howled on. Claire closed her eyes and drew a deep breath. In her mind, she was airborne again, not with engines, not with steel, but with the open sky itself, and with the ghost of yesterday now transformed into wings. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.
They saw the tattoo and their eyes widened. A small black star etched neatly on the left wrist of a silent female service member at Fort Bragg. Beneath the star was a line of encoded coordinates, something none of them understood, and none particularly cared about. They assumed she was just a logistics clerk, a striking figure with a bit of edgy ink to appear distinctive. That was until a SEAL commander entered the reception hall, caught sight of her forearm and snapped to attention with a salute. No words, no extra gesture. His crisp salute in the midst of the bustling room froze everyone in place. She did not blink. She did not react. She merely inclined her head in acknowledgement, as though she had been saluted like that before. Somewhere else, somewhere darker, where no one survived to tell the tale. And in that moment, the base began to ask itself, who is she really? Morning at Fort Bragg always began with the clank of steel on steel. The warehouse doors slid open, cartwheels groaned on the concrete floor, and amid those sounds, a woman appeared. No fanfare, no drama, just a silent shadow among hundreds of hurried footsteps. Lieutenant Haley Monroe, 30, in charge of Eastern Logistics. She was neither tall nor stern, nor did she project authority like many junior officers. Her hair was neatly tied back, uniform pristine, boots always polished. She moved through the base as if she'd been here for decades, though in truth, she'd been reassigned less than 8 months earlier. Behind the reception desk was a stack of file cabinets, a handwritten assignment board in precise script, and the aroma of coffee drifting from the thermos she'd bought herself. People referred to her as Lieutenant Monroe, polite enough to avoid criticism, distant enough that few bothered to learn more. She did her job well, never late, never mixing up shipment numbers, never uttering an unnecessary word. Perhaps the only thing that set her apart was her tattoo. A small black star, inked on her left wrist so discreet that only the right light would reveal it. Just below, a series of tiny etched numbers, 34.748, 8 degrees north, 92.2745 degrees west. They assumed it was a birth date, or an old address. As Private Torres joked, probably her favorite coffee shop coordinates, the group giggled, or where she goes to yoga. Haley didn't respond. She simply handed Torres the delivery slip, handwritten in block letters, 20 cases MRE, priority 3. When he looked up, she'd already turned and walked away slowly, deliberately. Her file folder cradled at her hip like an extension of herself. On this base, Glory seldom went to the quiet. Heavy boots, shouted orders on the drill yard, muscles glistening with sweat. That was how you got remembered. Not Haley. She didn't shout. She didn't recount past exploits. She appeared on schedule, completed her task precisely, and vanished as if she'd never been there. Some men tried the usual barracks, flirtations, off-color jokes, a wolf whistle as she passed, lingering glances at her tattoo, but Haley's response was nothing. Not cold, not friendly, simply unreachable. Once, Sergeant Blaine quipped, "Why so quiet, Lieutenant? Someone cut your vocal cords?" She looked up and held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. No furrowed brow, no answer. And Blaine never asked again. Partly because Haley disarmed them, partly because no one knew where she'd come from. No previous logistics officer at the base had mentioned her. Her transfer paperwork was a single-page reason, classified reassignment. In the military, classified usually means don't ask questions. She didn't attend ceremonies. She didn't dine in the mess. She never appeared in base press releases. The only thing she left behind were her signature, a form, and flawless results. In a place where everyone strived to prove something, Haley Monroe proved nothing, and that calm certainty made others uncomfortable. They viewed her like an unsolved puzzle, a song without a chorus, a blot of ink whose shape they couldn't read. Until that morning, when someone entered and saw the star, when a Tier 1 commander suddenly stopped mid-stride, snapped to attention, and saluted her before the entire unit. From that moment, every assumption began to melt away. Where did those coordinates point? And why did a SEAL commander salute first?
Welcome to Veteran Life Stories, where real sacrifice meets unforgettable storytelling. Subscribe and keep their courage alive.
Tuesday morning began like any other blazing sun, red dust coating the parking lot, and the growl of Humvee engines from the Northern Supply Depot. Haley was checking the inventory sheet in the warehouse when unfamiliar footsteps echoed at the door. Not hurried, not frantic, yet heavy and distinct enough to hush the entire room for a heartbeat. A convoy of black vehicles slid through the security gate. No logos, no unit plates, only a fine layer of road dust cloaking them in silent camouflage. Doors opened. 6 men disembarked. No smiles, no words. Sun-weathered faces, uneven stubble, and eyes that betrayed experience no uniform could hide. Trailing them was an older colonel, his gait slightly labored, yet his back remained as straight as a mast in a gale. He halted before the counter where Haley stood. No one spoke, no introductions were made. But when his gaze fell on her left wrist, Where the small black star tattoo peeked out, everything changed. He snapped to attention and saluted. Not a polite gesture, but the salute of a man who once owed another his life and never forgot. Everyone around froze, breath caught in throats. The small room felt too quiet for so grand an action. Haley said nothing. She simply inclined her head just enough to be seen. A silent acknowledgement, yet definitive. Then, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, she bent to sign the inventory sheet. At that moment, General Franklin, the commander of 3 Kunar campaigns, never one to show emotion before his subordinates exhaled, a sigh that sounded like an order. "Monroe, you're still active." His words dropped into the air like a heavy stone thrown into a placid lake. The logistics officers exchanged glances. Some pretended to check their screens, others furrowed their brows, but nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Only Torres, the supply specialist who joined the unit 3 months ago, peeked at Haley's tattoo and murmured so softly only he could hear, "Something's not right." That afternoon, laughter in the mess hall was muted. Someone discreetly Googled Haley's coordinates tattooed on her wrist, finding only forest and an empty expanse in Arkansas. Someone else tried to access the Hogstar mission files, but was blocked by an insufficient clearance notice. Haley continued her routine. Same black coffee, same file folder. But this time, something had shifted. No one dared stand too close. No one cracked jokes about her barista tattoo anymore. One of the Delta soldiers who'd mocked her ink returned 2 missing rifles that day, too afraid to meet her eyes. And when Haley reviewed the part's manifest, paused, and then nodded, he exhaled with relief as if he'd passed an unannounced special inspection. The truth remained unspoken, but the sense spread. Something lay deeper than what they'd seen. There was a reason she needed to prove nothing, yet compelled everyone to step back. And perhaps that tattoo was more than just a symbol. It was a warning to the quick to speak and a badge for those who had survived because of her. Why would a small tattoo silence both Colonel and Grunt? And what was Operation Hawkstar, really? Comment 1, or I'm still here, to keep listening. Tuesday's dawn at Fort Bragg began like every other with the clamor of steel on steel, Humvee engines growling at the northern supply point, and red dust swirling under the blazing Sunday. Haley was in the southern reception station, double-checking inventory manifests she'd reviewed since early morning, when unfamiliar footsteps echoed through the corridor. They weren't hurried, but each step struck the floor with weight, silencing the room in a heartbeat. Black vehicles glided through the security gate. No insignia, no unit markings, only a fine film of road dust serving as silent camouflage. 6 men emerged, no greetings, no chatter. Their sun-scarred faces and uneven stubble hinted at experience no uniform could conceal. Last came an older colonel, his gait slightly labored yet spine as straight as a mast in a storm. He stopped before Haley's desk. No one spoke or introduced him, but when his eyes fell on her left wrist, revealing the small black star tattoo, the atmosphere shifted. He snapped to attention and saluted. Not a polite nod, but the salute of a man who once owed another his life and never forgot. Everyone froze. Breaths caught. That small room felt impossibly still for such a grand gesture. Haley said nothing. She inclined her head just enough to acknowledge him and then, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, bent to sign the manifest. In that instant, General Franklin, the veteran of 3 Kunar campaigns, never one to show emotion before his troops, exhaled audibly, a sigh that sounded like an order. "Monroe, you're still active." His words fell like a stone dropped on glass. The logistics officers exchanged glances. Some pretended to check lists, others furrowed brows, but no one spoke, no one dared. Only Torres, the junior supply sergeant, lingered by Haley's wrist, whispering just loud enough for himself, "There's something off." That afternoon, Conversations in the mess hall were hushed. Someone discreetly Googled the tattooed coordinates, finding only forest and empty land in Arkansas. Another tried accessing the Hawkstar operation files, only to be blocked by insufficient clearance. Haley continued her routine black coffee, folder in hand, but everything had changed. No one dared stand too close. No one joked about her bartender tattoo anymore. Then the unexpected happened. North wind gusted across the base, carrying a strange, damp chill. The sky turned steel, gray, no promise of rain, no sun behind the clouds, just heaviness and silence. From the command center to the guard shacks, everyone felt it, but none could name it. Until the helicopter rotors tore through the stillness beyond the perimeter, then abruptly fell silent. No landing signal, no ATC notices. A stillness so profound that even those accustomed to chaos paused. And then, the power went out. The entire eastern sector plunged into darkness as if the main arteries had been drained of blood. Radar screens blacked out, surveillance cameras froze mid-pan, hall lights blinked and died. Radios hissed only static. The command center struggled to act, but every order was severed. Someone in the dark shouted, "Imp!" Control vanished everywhere, except one place, the southern reception station. There, lights still glowed, a small, independent power line, relic of the Cold War, cut off from the main grid, so outdated that no one bothered to upgrade it, and thus the one circuit still alive. And there stood Haley Monroe. No orders sent her there, no dispatch directed her. She'd been stationed there since dawn, checking manifests, awaiting the next convoy. No one expected her, yet she was there habitual, as if forewarned. When systems collapsed, she did not flee. She did not call out. She did not panic. She gently removed her headset, placed it on the desk, and rolled up her left sleeve. The black star appeared. The coordinates glimmered for a moment in the emergency lamp glow. Something in her eyes shifted. Not fear, not panic, but laser focus, the kind seen only in those who've crossed deserts, run through bullets, and chosen to live rather than rely on luck. The metallic click of a safety catch echoed as she flicked it off the M4 carbine stowed under her desk, a precise practice motion requiring no glance. Then she pressed the silent alarm switch, a signal sent solely over the physical circuit, bypassing the dead network. Outside, shadows appeared at the fence, 3 figures moving in the specialized formations of Tier 1 operators. Low, swift, silent, but they did not belong here. The first cut through the wire with handheld shears. The second swept for signals. The third waited, and Haley opened fire. First shot silent, exact. The intruder crumpled like sand emptied from a grain. The remaining 2 split left and right. One lobbed a flashbang at the gate guard, which Haley dodged, counting 3 beats before standing and firing 2 rapid shots. One struck the abdomen, the other caught the exposed shoulder. Precise. By the time the armed reaction team arrived, all they found were flickering lights, the scent of gunpowder, and 5 bodies neatly laid around the station. Haley stood in the center, carbine lowered, gaze unwavering. A senior officer approached to question her, but upon sighting the tattoo on her wrist, the black star and familiar coordinates, he stopped for a long moment, then saluted. The story spread faster than any transmitted order. And you'll probably want to know, where do those coordinates actually lead? And why was she the only one standing when every system had fallen? My dear audience, stay tuned for the next installment that will leave you speechless. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always thrilling to see viewers joining us from around the globe. The door of the southern checkpoint station slid open with a quiet hiss. Not rushed, not dramatic, like in an action movie. It simply opened, as if accustomed to doing so. But this time, What lay beyond that door was something no one at the base could have anticipated. The first intruder lunged in precision movement, weapon at the ready, low stance. In less than a second, he scanned the room's spotted cover and zeroed in on his target. But before he'd even fully planted his feet, Haley had squeezed the trigger. One shot, clean, no warning, no hesitation. Just the silent pushed from the suppressor, and he collapsed like a column severed at its base. The station air seemed to thicken. The wind whispered through the open door, carrying dust and something else. The chill of the unforeseen. 3 more figures appeared at the end of the corridor. No shouts. No panic. They were professionals, and they knew someone on the other side could shoot. But they hadn't grasped the full picture yet. Haley moved. Not like an ordinary soldier. No fanfare, no flurry. She slipped past each point as if her body were born for that space. A right-angle turn, an obstacle, a wall. She used them all as though drilled 1,000 times. The second intruder lobbed a stun grenade, an intelligent move. The canister spun, hit the floor, a flash. But Haley didn't need her eyes. She had counted. 1, 2, 3. She sprang up from behind the inventory table, leaned out, and fired 2 rapid shots. One target dropped. The remaining adversary pivoted sideways, trying to break line of sight. Mistake. A third shot found his shoulder. She advanced. Her heels never thundered on the floor. No metal clatter. No wasted breath. The final intruder, wiser, slipped into the shadow behind an electrical column, trying to call for backup. But the comms were down, the signal dead, and she was alive. Haley closed in from the right, low and silent as a breath. When he turned, she was already there, rifle steady, eyes unblinking. He raised his hands. Too late. One solid butt stroke from the rifle knocked him out. He collapsed, unconscious, without a sound loud enough to alert anyone outside. She did not fire another shot. There was no need. When the emergency response team swept in, armored vehicles rumbling behind them, the sight froze everyone. Alone, Haley stood in the center of the corridor, hair slightly tousled, rifle lowered at her thigh. Emergency lights reflected off her uniform, illuminating a smear of blood that wasn't hers. 4 bodies lay exactly where they'd fallen. No chaos, no sign of struggle, only the cold precision of someone who had anticipated every move. One officer muttered something about an avenging angel. Another exclaimed, "That's not logistics." But she did not listen. There was no need. She simply turned, walked back to the reception desk, retrieved her headset, and set it neatly in its original spot. Not a single superfluous motion. No explanations offered. She was not someone who needed to explain, certainly not after that night. So what does that black star truly represent, and who taught her to fight like that, in darkness, with such terrifying silence? When power was fully restored, systems stabilized, and response teams began inspecting the bodies of the intruders, a strange silence prevailed over Fort Bragg. Not the calm of safety, but the hush of realization. Lieutenant General Franklin was first to step down from the command vehicle, his combat boots striking the still smoldering concrete. He surveyed the scene without a word. His gaze settled on Haley Monroe, standing serenely as though she'd merely completed an inventory check rather than single-handedly neutralizing an armed assault. He offered a slight, wry smile, one laced with bitterness. You alone maintained order, while the entire system collapsed. No one answered. No one needed to. News spread as if broadcast on every military frequency, although no microphone had been turned on. Within hours, the entire base knew the truth. She was not just another logistics officer. And that tattoo, the black star with its enigmatic coordinates, was not mere ornamentation. At lunch in the mess hall, conversation dwindled to hushed tones. Young soldiers lingering at her table attempted casual banter, Yet the scrape of spoons on plastic trays sounded louder than ever. Some pretended to study the bulletin board, others left their meals unfinished. Faces that once mocked her now stole furtive glances toward the entrance where Haley entered, as always, black coffee on her tray, hair tied in a single knot, expression unchanged. No one laughed, no one dared. Some began calling her Hawkstar, first in whispers, then as an almost official call, sign within the unit. No one revived old jokes. No one used the word poser anymore. New arrivals were briefed. When you see her walk by, salute not because of her rank, but because she once held this base with 1 rifle and 3 rounds. The silence once equated with weakness had become a symbol of control. Discreet salutes replaced apologies. Some left bags of her favorite dried snacks with no note. Others cleaned the bench where she sat each morning. No one mentioned it, yet everyone helped. Sergeant Blaine, the same one who once quipped about her vocal cords, now stands guard whenever she passes. He never meets her eyes. He never speaks. But when he snaps to attention, he grips his shoulder strap as though chastising himself. Only Haley remains unchanged. She still arrives on schedule, still verifies manifests, still silent, still ties her hair in a single loop. Nothing outwardly different except for the eyes watching her. Once, a group of senior officers from the Pentagon visited part of the post-incident review team. When they heard the name Haley Monroe, they did not ask about her role. They simply exchanged knowing glances, and one quietly withdrew a notebook to jot down a line. Young Private Hayden, the one who first murmured, "Something's not right," has now been assigned as her aide. He addresses her as Lieutenant Monroe, with such genuine respect that others assume it's a higher rank. She never sought recognition, yet recognition found her in the most natural way. The gate at the Southern Station, once dismissed as the most tedious post on the base, has been repainted. A faded banner now reads, "We stand firm because some never left." They don't name names, but everyone knows whose story it is. And if she never truly departed, perhaps, she was never meant to stand down. Thursday morning at Fort Bragg began with the rich aroma of coffee and the heavy footsteps echoing along the concrete corridors. But one small thing had changed. On the bulletin board by the Southern Checkpoint Station, someone had affixed a small badge, a simple black metal star, no name, no caption. It sat next to the spot where Haley Monroe habitually rested her hand whenever she signed paperwork. No one admitted to placing it, nor did anyone dare remove it. It belonged there as if it had always been part of that space. 2 days had passed since the attack, yet the base had not truly returned to normal. Something deeper was stirring a shift in awareness. Like an unseen tremor underground, felt by everyone though no one saw its source. Haley carried on with her duties. No extra medals, no leave requests, no talk of what had transpired. She sought no recognition. She needed no headlines or praise. The only constant she kept was her routine. Walk to the station, verify manifests, upload data, and pour a cup of black coffee strong and unsweetened. Now, the checkpoint guards saluted her first, sometimes with a loud call of "Ma'am," other times a subtle nod, each genuine. In the military, respect doesn't stem from ribbons. It comes from unspoken acknowledgement. Haley received that acknowledgement in a way few ever do. In the logistics office where she'd once been ignored, there was now an empty chair always kept next to her desk. No one dared sit in it, as if preserving a space of honor. Someone even wrote on the backrest with erasable marker, "Reserved for the one who stayed." Sometimes, during long shifts, new recruits would quietly ask, "Did she really?" But no one dared elaborate. The story didn't belong to the teller, it belonged to her, the one who never told it. At a weekend briefing, Lieutenant Colonel Rourke, one of the first to notice her tattoo, stood and placed an old map on the table. A red circle marked exactly the coordinates inked on Haley's wrist. Someone asked, "What's that?" He simply replied, "It's where we lost people, and where one returned." No one asked further. At the checkpoint, the afternoon shadows lengthened slowly. Fort Bragg's sunset blazed orange, casting the soldiers' silhouettes over the red earth. Haley leaned against the steel railing, eyes on the horizon. Her hand rested on her document folder as always. But this time, a black star badge was carefully pinned to her nameplate. No one knew when it had appeared. A squad of young soldiers passed by. They said nothing, but one by one, unprompted, each offered her a quiet salute. A small gesture, but enough to shift the mood. She did not salute back, nor did she turn away. She simply stood there as usual, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. And perhaps to her, it never was. In the base's duty logbook, in the lower left margin, someone had penned by hand, "No one stands there by choice. They stand there because they refuse to step back." No signature, but everyone knew who had written it. And if a simple black star can be redeemed by one person, then perhaps at every base across America, there waits a silent symbol ready to be understood at its true value. In days when we too easily judge a person by their tattoo, their rank, or a slight smile in a hallway, perhaps we should remember Haley Monroe. Not because she is Hawkstar, but because she chose silence, chose service, chose to stand firm even when no one was watching. Her story is a reminder that heroes sometimes need no introduction. They only need trust in the right moment. And sometimes, a small symbol like the star on her wrist can represent a lifetime of quiet dedication behind it. If this story makes you think of someone you once misjudged, please share it. If you've ever felt invisible despite giving so much, leave a comment. We want to hear you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because here, the most silent stories are often the ones that need to be told most.